set your intention bodhicitta, benefit of all beings. We're going to engage in some teaching, some reflection on why the number 8 and the number 9 are so important in the Dharma. So the whole reason, there's 8s that appear in mandalas, there's 8s that appear in the yanas, there's 8s that appear over and over again, 8 manifestations, 8 commands of sadhana practice, is because of the 8 consciousnesses that are at the heart of our own experience. And that's why there's also 8 petals in the heart chakra. So there's 8 petals in the heart chakra, it's shaped like a flower, and then there's the center, which is the 9th. So these 8 petals represent the 8 forms of consciousness. And it's very easy for us to know about the first 5. They're the sense consciousnesses. So it's the consciousness of touch, taste, smell, consciousness of sight, consciousness of sound. So those 5 senses, when they're known by these consciousnesses, are just known directly in the present moment. There's no naming, there's no grasping, there's no interpretation. The sense consciousness is just perceived directly, the outer world. So it's also often called the coarse mind. The coarse mind is what perceives the outer world, the world of form, the world of substance. So that information is then gathered in through these 5 consciousnesses and assembled in the 6th consciousness, which is the consciousness of mind. So this consciousness also, it gathers all 5 senses together, and there's no level of interpretation yet. It's just gathering them together into this 3-dimensional experience that we know when we look out into the world. We think we're seeing it out there, but where we're seeing it is in the 6th consciousness. We're seeing what the 5 senses receive through the coarse process of perception in the 6th consciousness. So that 6th consciousness is really a clearinghouse for all the sensory information, all sensory perception, all of our ability to perceive the objects of the senses. So up until the 6th consciousness, we don't have any problems. We have consciousness that stays in the present moment and that receives information from the outer world. Then the 7th consciousness is what's often referred to as either the emotional consciousness or the consciousness of mental formation or the diluted consciousness. And so it isn't really emotional the way we think of it in the Western sense, psychologically. What it is the 7th consciousness is where we have interpretation. So we have this 6th consciousness, which is absorbing all of the 5 senses, and we're experiencing it in the present moment. And the 7th consciousness is where we start to name it, compare it, interpret it. And that's where the idea of a separate self starts to occur. That's where the mind gets diluted. So that's the place where we start to think, well, I'm here and the world is out there. We divide it into this dualistic experience. And the 7th consciousness, because it divides things in this way, which is ignorance in Buddhism, it is the place that is the source of all the poisons of the mind. So ignorance in Buddhism isn't being dumb. Ignorance in Buddhism is believing in a separate self. Believing that there's a self in here and there's a world out there. That primary division into self and other is ignorance in Buddhism. And because of that belief in a separate self that's in here, then we start to try and attract things that are pleasant to the separate self and avoid things that are unpleasant to the separate self. And in this way we start pushing and pulling our experience, and we create waves of karma. Whatever we pull towards ourselves will eventually move away. Whatever we push away will eventually come back. So we think that we're in control. We think, I just want things that make me happy. And really, attachment to happiness is suffering. We think happiness is good, but attachment to happiness is the source of suffering. So ignorance is the source of attachment and aversion, and attachment and aversion are both the source of suffering. We know that aversion to suffering has something to do with suffering, but we don't usually consider that attachment to happiness is the source of suffering as well. So these 3 are the primary poisons of the mind. Ignorance, believing in a separate self, an attachment to happiness or pleasure, and aversion to suffering or unhappiness. So attachment, aversion, and ignorance are the source of all of our karma. When we purify our karma, we're purifying attachment and aversion. And eventually we get to the subtlety of purifying this concept of a separate self, ignorance. So that's what our practice is for, is to slowly work our way back to the point where we made this incorrect assumption that there's a separate self. And so there's a lot of examples given in the teachings about that interpretation of experience and why it's diluted. So there's the example of when you walk into a room and it's dark and there's a coiled rope and you mistake it for a snake, and you have all of these ideas about the snake and fear about the snake, and you run out and tell everybody about the snake, but if you turn on the light, you see that there's no snake, that there never was a snake, that there's nothing to be afraid of, that there's nothing to warn anybody about. So there was never ever a snake, but you perceived something and then you interpret it as a snake. And then aversion arises and fear arises and all these things arise, but there never was a snake. So in the same way, there was never a separate self. The rope will never be a snake. There never will be a separate self. No matter how much experience we have that we've generated through countless lifetimes, believing in a separate self, generating all these experiences of attachment and aversion, it was never there to begin with. So we are actually pure of a separate self, but we don't know it. We're actually free of ignorance, but we don't know it yet. So in this very moment, while we're operating on the basis of ignorance, the belief in a separate self, we're actually right now free of it, but we don't know it. So we have to learn how to recognize that we're free of a separate self. We have to trick our mind into knowing the truth. It takes a while because we believe the delusion. But through Dharma practice, we fool ourselves into believing what's actually true. And then over time, we come to know that it's the truth, that we're not fooling ourselves. So at first, it's all talk. We say, oh, there is no separate self, there is no inherent self or existence of a separate self. We say it, but we don't know it. We don't feel it. It isn't an experience. It's just a concept. And so we're basically operating out of this diluted seventh consciousness, and we're trying to counteract all of this habit of consciousness to build up the idea of a separate self based on perception. And all of this is happening within us, and at the same time we start to think, in order to counter this misbelief, I'm going to think there is no separate self. But it's still also just conceptual. So we're still acting as if the rope is a snake. We're just trying to erase the snake instead of recognizing the rope. We're trying to say there is no separate self instead of realizing that there is no separate self. So what happens with the seventh consciousness is that it starts to pollute everything. So we start to pollute the sixth consciousness, which was pure, into interpreting what perception is perceiving, what the sense consciousnesses are perceiving. The seventh consciousness kind of spills a little into the sixth consciousness because we're interpreting things as being solid. We're interpreting the self as being real. So we not only have separated things into duality, but then we believe that self is real and the world is solid. We don't see the emptiness of self. We don't see the emptiness of other. So we're trapped in this belief in solid and real. Solid and real. The elements are solid, the experiences of self are real. So these experiences of self that arise are what happen in the seventh consciousness. This belief in a self. This belief that all of the memories of the experiences we've had in the past point to the existence of a separate self. And this belief that all of the ideas and plans we have for the future point to the existence of a separate self. But this is all deluded, because there is no self. There is the experience of a self, but there is no truth or lasting self. There is no truth to the idea that the self is real. So it's hard to escape this idea that the self is real. We're like, I'm here. I'm experiencing this. How could the self not be real? But in Buddhism, we look at real and relative as two different things, two different ways of expressing the truth. So there's absolute truth, which is real, and there's relative truth, which is an approximation, something that's false that approximates the truth. So relative truth is made up of parts. All of our bodies made up of parts, composite phenomenon. All of the elements come together and make objects that we perceive. So it's the elements coming together, composite. The one thing that doesn't come together out of parts is space, openness. So outwardly we can see that openness, or space, is pure in that it isn't made up of parts. Parts are things that come together, and because they come together, they fall apart. Whatever comes together falls apart. Whatever is born dies. Whatever begins ends. So all of the elements outwardly and all of the experiences of self inwardly are made up of these parts. The experiences of self are made up of memories, plans, thoughts, all feeding on the perceptions coming in through the sixth consciousness. All of these parts mean that this consciousness is made of parts, and therefore it has a beginning and it has an end. Parts come together, parts fall apart. So then, if that's what the seventh consciousness is, then what's the eighth consciousness? The eighth consciousness is called the base, or ji, the foundation. The base consciousness is not engaged in the idea of a separate self. It's not engaged in ideas at all. But it is like a storehouse of karma. So believing in a separate self because of our seventh consciousness, we do all of these actions of attraction and aversion, pushing things around. We do things with our body, speech, and mind, trying to be happy and trying to avoid pain. And every action, every push away, and every pull towards gets recorded in this eighth consciousness, the foundation. So it's almost like the ground. Every footstep is in the ground. You can see it, you can follow the trail. So the ground of consciousness, every thought, every word, every deed, every action of body, speech, and mind are recorded there. So this is where, again, the seventh consciousness, because of its belief in a separate self, is making imprints on the eighth consciousness, making an effect on the eighth consciousness. Just like it does, spreads into the sixth consciousness a little, it makes this impact and impression on the eighth consciousness. So this is a very subtle part of the mind. When we meditate for long periods of time, we can sometimes get past the seventh consciousness into this storehouse. The alaya is what it's called in Sanskrit. Ji is what it's called in Tibetan. This foundation, we can get there, and we can be meditating in a state where we're not thinking about a separate self. We're not living in a conceptual state of mind. We're in this state of oneness, but there's still a subtle separation, because all of these traces of our karma, positive and negative, that come from the belief in a separate self are stored there. So even if we're not thinking of ourselves as a self, all of the habits of belief in a separate self are still there. All of the habits of delusion are still there. So a lot of times in Tibetan they'll call this bakchak, the mental habit of belief in a separate self, the habit of delusion. This stuff is held over from all of our experiences of self that arise in the seventh consciousness, that are arising out of delusion, out of belief in a separate self. So we have 5 sense consciousnesses that purely perceive the outer world, a sixth consciousness that organizes all of that into one experience, a seventh consciousness which begins to interpret and label and name everything, and therefore starts this delusion of believing in a separate self, and therefore starts to create actions of body, speech, and mind, both positive and negative, that create karma, the seeds of karma. And then the traces of those karmas that we create are stored in the eighth consciousness. So those are these 8 consciousnesses that form the 8 petals of the lotus in our heart. They're all there. So then you say, what's in the center?